For Unit 9, we are going to start talking about punctuation, okay? Without punctuation, reading would just be really exhausting and so confusing. We're going to talk about different types of punctuation like commas, dashes, and ellipses. But we may talk about some other things in there as well, but those are the main ones that we're going to focus on. Don't forget that Google Docs and Word both have features in them that help you with conventions, and so does Grammarly, so you can copy and paste into Grammarly and have it check stuff for you. But conventions include grammar, spelling, punctuation, and capitalization. So don't forget to use those tools when you are writing things, especially your essays, to go back and look for things that are underlined in blue or red or have suggestions on them. When you're in both Word and Google Docs, it does that for you. And I include instructional videos for the essays where it shows you how to change your settings so that they'll check that for you and how to use those features. So make sure you check out those videos because you will need that for like next semester and pretty much from this point on all the way through high school and into college. So make sure you look at those. All right, so let's look at a couple of videos on introduction to punctuation. Why is punctuation even that important? Let's find out.
To introduce the subject of punctuation, I'd like to just talk about our attitude towards punctuation. And I think often what happens is that we have a sort of conflicted attitude, because on the one hand we laugh at punctuation mistakes, but we often don't actually take it seriously enough to really make the effort to learn what the different punctuation rules are. And we kind of fumble along intuitively and try to make some sense of it. So what I'd like to talk about is really this effort of shifting from the more comical aspects of misused punctuation to the more serious effort to really understand what's going on. And the more comical side of it is illustrated by these kinds of sayings and quotations and signs. And I think you've probably seen these kinds of things if you've looked on Facebook in the last little while. And some of your friends may have posted these kinds of things. So the first one here, if somebody says, "Let's eat dad," there should be a comma here because we don't really want to eat dad. And then the second one here is called the grocer's apostrophe, because you see it in a lot of grocery stores where we've used an apostrophe to form the plural, which is incorrect. And then the last one is this funny kind of sign that implies that the pedestrians are slippery when wet. And you can look up these things, online, and you'll see way more signs and funny sayings like this. But the trouble is, how do we get from here to actually really thinking about punctuation and how it works? So I have an example here, and what I'd like you to think about as you look at this example is that we have to make the connection between punctuation and these other parts of grammar, which are sentence structure and parts of speech. And that is really the onerous task. You need to know something about how sentence structure works, how clauses work, how phrases work. And if you haven't really mastered that, then you need to go back and study that and then come to punctuation. Okay, because otherwise it really doesn't make sense. If you can't find the subject, for instance, you're going to have a bit of a struggle with punctuation. But if you do know those things, then there is a real beauty to punctuation, because a lot of it makes complete sense. So if we look at this example, for instance, in the beginning we just wanted an adventure, in the end we just wanted to go home. We have a nice parallel structure here, and each of these parts of the sentence, separated by the semicolon here, starts with an introductory phrase in the beginning, in the end. Okay, so we can map this out. We can say, well, this is an introductory phrase, and we're just going to put it in a box here, and then we're going to put a comma after it, and then we get an independent clause. Independent clause. And together these can form a sentence, but we can also stick a semicolon between these two, and then we repeat the same thing again. So then we have our second introductory phrase and our second independent clause. And when we do this, we can see that these things are very neatly parallel, and there's a kind of beauty to this. If we know these kinds of things, if we know that a semicolon typically connects two independent clauses that are closely linked like this, then we don't succumb to what I sometimes tend to think of as kind of the breathing theory of punctuation, which is this notion that when you write, you should just think of punctuation as the spaces where there's a pause. And if you have a longer pause, you put a semicolon, shorter pause, it's a comma, and so on. That is complete rubbish. Well, there's some truth to it because sometimes you do pause, but it's really misleading. And you end up with all these weird situations where you have semicolons that are in the wrong place, commas that are unnecessary, and that's because people haven't taken the trouble to really understand grammar, to understand sentence structure and parts of speech. But I do promise you that if you work through the sections on punctuation, you're going to see the beauty of punctuation, and it will actually have a great deal of clarity. And if you think about the different parts of the sentence as working together and punctuation as connecting those different parts, you're really going to enjoy the lessons on punctuation, and it's going to make a lot of sense.
If there's anything about writing that feels like a bunch of arbitrary rules, it's probably punctuation. Put commas here, but not there. Use colons before lists, but only sometimes. Fix run-on sentences with semicolons. Don't forget to use dashes sparingly. Because our first introduction to punctuation is always so rules-heavy, it can be really difficult to see that punctuation is actually one of a writer's most useful tools. It's not just something you need to do so that persnickety readers won't judge you. It's an efficient and meaningful way to show your readers how to read what you write. The first time I saw just how significant punctuation can be, I was in northeastern Brazil studying out of a little red grammar book. In the midst of all the subjunctive verbs, collective nouns, and grammatical government rules, there was a story of a wealthy man who scrawled out his will moments before he died. Unfortunately, he wrote it without any punctuation, giving all the parties competing claims to his vast wealth. Even in my less than elegant translation, you can see how differences in punctuation can lead to wildly different interpretations. The man's nephew punctuated his copy of the will like this, making a strong case that only he should inherit the wealth. However, the man's sister had her own version, punctuated just as legitimately, but in support of a different conclusion. Of course, the tailor had his version too, and the poor had theirs. Not only is the case of the ambiguous inheritance an amusing linguistic parlor trick, it also illustrates the power of punctuation. Here, punctuation isn't just about being right or wrong according to rules, which is something that an editor could fix over lunch. Punctuation is something that tells readers which words belong together and which ones don't, which is something that could have armies of lawyers scratching their heads for ages. In other words, punctuation is useful because it shows readers how your sentences are put together, something that then helps them to understand what you mean to say in a quiet and efficient way. But beyond that, punctuation also helps readers to hear the rhythm and voice in your writing, and I'm willing to bet that that's not something you'll ever learn in school. For example, this block of text is really easy to read in a monotone. One time I went to the park and looked for blackberries in the bushes, but I couldn't find any. I decided to look for mushrooms instead, something that I was nervous but also excited to do. I set out and found a few, but not as many as I'd hoped because it started raining. I had to go home early. Throw in some punctuation though, and now you can hear the writer's voice shine through much more clearly. One time I went to the park and looked for blackberries in the bushes, but I couldn't find any. I decided to look for mushrooms instead, something that I was nervous but also excited to do. I set out and found a few, but not as many as I'd hoped. Because it started raining, I had to go home early. As before, we see punctuation doing more here than just following rules. The dashes, commas, and exclamation points all tell us something about how these words would sound if they had been spoken rather than written. Punctuate thoughtfully, and you can give your readers a much more dynamic reading experience, or, at the very least, learn how punctuation works, and you can read things out loud without putting everyone else in the room to sleep. So our goal in this series is to introduce you to the realities of punctuation beyond the rules you might have learned in school, and to equip you with a deeper understanding of how each of these marks can work as grammatical guideposts and rhetorical road signs for your readers. Really, the goal is to help you to put your punctuation to work, turning it into a real tool for enhancing your writing and engaging your readers. And I'm excited to get started.